This is Pushi's World, which is a game I've been working on for over a year at this point. If you've watched some of my older videos, you may know that Pushi's World is a game developed on Scratch. However, just about 3 months ago, that changed. Now, Pushi's World is being developed on Unity, which is a much more efficient and sophisticated game engine. But there's just one issue. Up until I started developing Pushi's World on Unity, I hadn't actually used Unity. And in case you weren't aware, when you're developing a game with a game engine, it's pretty important to actually know how to use that game engine. Anyway, Olympic class yapping aside, I'll just get on with what this video is actually supposed to be about, specifically the physics that govern Pushi's movement. And in the 3 months I've spent working on the latest version of this project, I believe that I've perfected every single aspect of Pushi's platforming physics. But how can I say that these platforming physics are actually perfect? After all, isn't how well a game plays a subjective matter? Well, I believe there actually is a way to make an objectively good platformer, which is exactly what I'll be showing you how I did today. So let's hop right into it. To start off, let's look at the goals I had while starting to make this engine. First of all, I wanted Pushi to be fun to play as at any skill level. A good example of this is Super Mario Odyssey. In Odyssey, a beginner player only really runs and jumps, but you can still complete the game. However, a more skilled player can perform much more complex movement, allowing them to find shortcuts in the level, do cool tricks, or just have fun moving around. Complex movement being incentivized but not required is a really good technique to make a good game. However, it's not the only piece of the puzzle. Next up on the list of goals, intuitive movement. This is just a fancy way of saying making the player move good. Basically, I want the player to be able to react to obstacles in time, even if their reaction time is a bit slow. And finally, on the topic of player input, the number of keys the player needs to press to play the game shouldn't be too many. I only plan on using 7 keys for gameplay in Pushi's World, the 4 arrow keys and 3 other keys, Z, X, and C, to make him perform various actions. So, now to make all of this into a game, on Unity, which, remember, I have no idea how to use. Well, actually I did know a little bit about Unity from the time I tried following a tutorial on how to use it, but that was cut short because the power went out halfway through the tutorial. So back in Unity at about the end of June of this year, I had forgotten everything I had learned other than the fact that if you don't end your lines of code with a semicolon, you die in real life. So it should come as no surprise that I immediately ran into a huge roadblock when making this project: collision detection. In Unity, there's no sprite sensing based collision. Well, actually, yes there is, but it sucks. So I had to resort to using another method which worked a lot better for the way I'm used to programming game engines: raycasting. Raycasting works by taking a point and giving it a direction, which makes a ray. If said ray hits anything, the exact point where it contacts is tracked by a collider subclass. Using this, I could start making collision detection. I do this by firing a ray in the direction that Pushi is moving and cap its distance at Pushi's current speed. I actually do X and Y axis collisions separately, which simplifies this greatly and also prevents glitchy behavior like getting caught on corners. Anyway, after firing this ray, I checked the collider subclass I mentioned earlier. Something I want to mention quickly is that a class in programming is similar to an adjective or a describing word in the English language, like the car is blue. Back to the collider on the raycast, I checked to see if the collider hit anything, which is what != null means here. ! Equals is just not equal, and then null is programming slang for nothing. If the collider did hit something, then Pushi's movement should be cut short to where the collider hit. So I set Pushi's position to that point. However, if the collider didn't hit anything, Pushi still has to move. So if that's the case, I changed Pushi's position by his X or Y speed, depending on which axis he's currently moving on. Okay, if you're still awake after that very one-sided lecture, I'm sorry, but we are still not done. This engine still has 2 main flaws, one of which being very obvious. Pushi's hitbox is way too small. This is because raycasts only do collision detections at a single point. Fortunately, this can be fixed by just doing multiple raycasts in a way similar to what I used to do on Scratch with tile-based collisions. If you've ever worked with tiles, I'm sure the code on screen will look very familiar to you, and that's exactly what I did on Unity, just in C#, so it's a lot less visually appealing. Anyway, the other issue is way more subtle, and its fix is even more so. Right now, if I try to move Pushi along a wall, he gets caught. At first, this confused me because I thought doing collisions on separate axes would fix this issue, but clearly not. The reason for this is actually because of the way I cut off Pushi's movement when he collides. Remember how when Pushi hits a wall, his position is set to exactly the point that the raycast hit the wall? Well, that's the exact cause of my problem. That point we set Pushi's position to is a solid point, and thus, movement in any direction would be impossible from there, because the ray would collide instantly. The fix is very simple. When I set Pushi's position to be exactly on the point where the ray collided, I move him back just a tiny bit in the opposite direction he just moved, by a few thousandths of a unit. God, that's hard to say. For a sense of scale, a Pushi's World unit is the size of a pixel on one of the level tiles. A thousandth of that distance wouldn't even alter the pixels on a 1080p display. Okay, yeah, you can definitely see it now. This is how small of a gap there is. There's a hole between these two tiles. Pushi is currently a millionth of his normal size. That is him. Anyway, with that issue out of the way, let's get into extending the hitbox. I first defined a sprite width and height that I could use to modify at runtime to test different hitbox sizes. Once I did that, I used these variables to create a matrix of points that several raycasts would use to run the collision detection scripts from. Finally, if one of them collided, I would subtract the offset of that point from the collider's position when setting Pushi's position, which cancels out the initial offset of the point. One last thing, running the collision scripts for 8 separate points does mean that if none of the points collide, Pushi will move 8 times his current speed and distance. To fix this, I separated this part of the code and placed it at the end of both the X and Y movement scripts. In its place in the old script, I would set a collided boolean variable to true if the raycast ever hit anything. A boolean variable just returns true or false. Finally, in the collision code, I replaced any raycast checks with the new collided variable to finish this modification of the code. Okay, I promise the collision detection yapping is over for this episode, so now we can move on to the actual platforming engine. I started by giving Pushi his basic running and jumping, which are the only moves that casual players would use most of the time, so I wanted these moves to feel good to use. I started by giving Pushi a fast acceleration so that he feels quick and agile. Fun fact, I actually used to have Pushi's grounded max speed faster than it currently is, but I decided to reserve that quicker top speed to only be active while airborne to encourage hopping, which is how I imagine Pushi would move in real life. Anyway, onto Pushi's jumps. At the start of a jump, Pushi gains a little boost of horizontal speed. This little trick is done in many modern-day platformers like Celeste to make the player's jump a little bit longer to make tight jumps more easily doable. However, there's also something new to this engine that I brought back from an old Scratch build. The very first version of Pushi's World made the first frame of Pushi's jump more powerful than the rest. I brought this back but balanced it out to feel a bit more natural. This will be a lot more useful once I add in actual obstacles for Pushi to jump over, because the first frame of the jump will be enough for Pushi to clear a one-tile jump instantly. Next up, when Pushi releases the jump button, he'll stop moving upwards also almost instantly, which will also be more useful when there's more obstacles for Pushi to dodge. That's a lot of alsos in one sentence. Lastly, at the apex of Pushi's jump, he'll fall slower, but gravity still applies the same way. This might be a little bit confusing, but basically at the apex of Pushi's jump, his vertical speed moves him less than it usually does. However, the force of gravity on Pushi isn't reduced. One last thing before I move on from jumping, when Pushi runs off a ledge, his ability to jump isn't taken right away. This is called Coyote Time, and it's very popular in all types of platformers today because it makes the game feel more fair, which is exactly why I added it to my game. Alright, now on to the more fun and way less boring moves. Pushi can crouch by pressing down on the ground. Okay, that's not a good start. While crouching, Pushi can move, but much slower than he can normally. He can also jump while crouched, which gives him the same horizontal speed boost as jumping, and also allows Pushi to go really fast when crouch jumping through one-tall tunnels. Also, when Pushi is in the air while crouching, his max speed is set to be the same as his normal grounded speed. Also, crouching has a fun little squish animation which I plan to talk about and add upon in a future video. Anyway, since crouching only works on the ground, I can use the down key for another action while Pushi is in the air, the ground pound. As I said, it's activated by pressing down in the air, and it makes Pushi perform a front flip, making him rise into the air, before Pushi shoots downwards at a high speed. I plan on this ability being used to break certain objects, or maybe even pieces of level geometry. This ground pound is also useful for the little bit of height it gains. Normally, Pushi just barely can't make a 5-tile jump, but with a ground pound at a bit of speed, he can. One last thing about the ground pound before we move on, he can press up to cancel the ground pound. Don't have that written down in my script, but I thought it was an important thing to mention. Okay, anyway, back to the video. Pushi can actually perform another ability out of a ground pound, the dive. Pushi can dive by pressing X during a ground pound. This works at any point during the ground pound, and even before the ground pound animation starts playing. That is called an instant dive, and it's going to be very useful for speedrunners of the game. Diving gives Pushy an upwards boost for a brief time, and it also propels Pushy forward slightly faster than his normal aerial acceleration. However, if Pushy's horizontal speed is over the diving speed, then Pushy can maintain that higher speed during a dive. Also, if Pushy is diving and performs an instant dive, then Pushy will also keep that higher vertical speed, allowing him to make higher jumps, possibly allowing a 6 or 7 tile jump. Finally, Pushy can perform one last move by default, wall jumping. This works differently than the other forms of wall jumping I've made because now Pushy doesn't wall slide. I changed this because I realized it makes literally no sense for Pushy to be able to wall slide, and Pushy also told me that this wasn't lore accurate. So, anyway, the actual wall jump still works the same way. Pushy can jump while facing a wall, at which point he'll jump away from it. However, to get this to work without mega cheese, I have to force Pushy to move away from the wall he just jumped off of so that he can't simply scale the wall. And also, I do an extra check to see if he's below the point of the last wall jump, in case there's a situation like this, where there's a wall in the way of Pushy's wall jump, causing him to reach the first wall anyway and to still gain height. This is really just pointless though, because at that point Pushy can just jump up with the other wall. The actual reason I have this extra check is because I do let Pushy turn around sooner than he should after a wall jump, so that he can gain a tiny bit of extra height to clear a very tall wall. Awesome. As I continue to work on Pushy's world, I'll be refining these moves so that they work perfectly in any scenario Pushy happens to be in. This will be especially hard to do when I add Pushy's other moves and level-specific gimmicks, like moving platforms, but it will be 100% worth it. Speaking of these extra moves, I want to briefly talk about some of those before the end of this devlog. First of all, the last move Pushy will be able to do without extra help from a level gimmick, twirling. This will be a pretty complex mechanic though. Pushy will have 4 types of twirls: normal, side twirls, up twirls, down twirls, and recovery twirls. There will also be a super version of every type of twirl except recovery twirls. This is because recovery twirls will only be able to be performed after certain actions. The super animation will basically be a double spin in whatever direction Pushy is twirling in, and super twirls will be possible if Pushy is moving at a high speed. Anyway, the up, normal, and down twirls will give speed boosts in one direction while costing it in another. So up twirls will give a lot of upward speed, but will take a lot of horizontal speed. Normal twirls will give a little upward speed boost while costing a little bit of horizontal speed. And finally, down twirls would give a bit of horizontal speed, but would cost some vertical speed. Specifically, down twirls would accelerate Pushy downwards a little bit faster than normal. And also, once again, I don't have this written down in my script, but the super twirls will give the same or even a little bit better of an upwards boost, but they will take less of Pushy's speed. So if he's moving at a high speed, there's a little bit of a benefit for that. That's what I have planned for twirling, but I haven't actually made it yet. I do plan on talking a bunch about twirls when I do get them made though, so watch out for a video on that not too long from now. Anyway, I do have 2 more planned things that involve Pushy's movement. However, rather than being part of Pushy himself, these things are level gimmicks. The objects in question are moving platforms and swing handles. If you've ever programmed a game before, you'll know these 2 things are possibly the most broken things to ever be put in a video game, and are also incredibly hard to code. And I'm trying to put these in most levels in my game. So, wish me luck. Please. Anyway, moving platforms are pretty self-explanatory. They move Pushy along with them while he's on them, and they also give Pushy a speed boost when he jumps off. While I'm not entirely sure how I want these platforms to work, all I know for now is that I want Pushy to be able to gain tons of speed easily with these, which I'm hoping will make for fun, action-packed sections of gameplay. Finally, the swing handles are also pretty self-explanatory in probably every aspect, other than how does Pushy use them exactly? Well, this is where this thingy comes in. This is a keychain that my real-life Pushy has. In real life, it's kind of useless other than the fact that it allows me to smuggle him into school, but in-game, he'll be able to use it to swing around, and, of course, gain tons of speed. So yeah, there's everything I have planned for Pushy's world at the moment. I will definitely be able to get all of the stuff added by the end of the year, and will hopefully be able to make 1, maybe 2 videos about those features. I made a post for what I'm about to say a few days ago, but if you haven't read it, I'll paraphrase it here. Basically, I've been super lazy with YouTube stuff, and I'm sorry for leaving you guys hanging for so long. I'd also like to thank you for sticking with me despite my lack of uploads and getting me past 650 subscribers. All I need is 350 more, and then I'll start to get cash money, which will be awesome. One more thing before I sign off is that devlogs are very hard to make because I'm still learning Unity and I'm not nearly as efficient in making games there as I used to be on Scratch. So I really don't have anything interesting to talk about that could make one of these commentated YouTube videos. So instead, I'm going to be uploading more random videos that will show my development progress in a more informal way. You'll be able to find those in a playlist that I'll link at the end of this video once the said playlist is created. One last thing, I have a Twitch channel too, and I plan on streaming game development on it every so often. So if you want, follow me there so you don't miss it. Anyway, thanks for watching, have a good day or night wherever you are, and I hope to see you guys later. Goodbye.